to the Operations and Safety Committee of the RTD. My name is Kate Williams. I am the chairman. This meeting will now come to order. We are convened as of 5:30 p.m. I would ask that everyone attending this meeting please mute themselves until they are recognized to speak. Thank you all for joining us. Please note that the committee meetings of the RTD Board of Directors are held remotely via Zoom and are audio and video recorded. Meeting recordings, along with the unofficial minutes of the meetings, will be posted as soon as possible on the board's website, which is rtd-denver.com. A live stream of the meeting is also available via RTD's YouTube page. Directors and members of RTD staff, if you would like to be acknowledged during tonight's proceedings, please raise your virtual hand and wait for me to call on you before proceeding to speak. Directors and staff participating by phone can also raise their virtual hands to indicate that they would like to speak by pressing *9. You can also toggle their mute settings on the phone by pressing *6. I'm now going to call the roll for the committee members. I would appreciate if you would acknowledge that you're here when you hear your name. Director Bouquet.
Present.
Director Broom.
Present.
Director Rusha.
Present, thank you.
Director Sloan.
Here.
Director Whitmore is unable to join us this evening. I am present. Director Williams. Do I see Director Rosenthal in the, there you are. Thank you, sir. For the record, I note that we also have Directors Tisdale, Geisinger, Catlin, Guzman, Davidson. Did I miss anybody? Nope. Okay. If there are, I'm going to ask the board staff if there are any hands raised for public comment.
I do not see any hands raised at this time, and there were no emails.
Thank you, Ms. Parrish. That takes care of a big chunk of this. And I can go right on to information from external entities, since we are closing the public comment section of this committee meeting due to no participation. There is also no information from external entities this month, so we will go to recommended actions. There are 2 recommended actions on the agenda this evening. The first action is low or no emission facilities and fleet transition plan, scope of work, summary approval, and contract authorization. This reads for the Board of Directors to approve the summary scope of work for a solicitation and to subsequently authorize the general manager and CEO to enter into a contract for consulting services for the development of a low or no emission facilities and fleet transition plan compliant with the bipartisan infrastructure law, publication L.117-58, in an amount not to exceed $10 million. Do I have a motion?
So move, Bouquet.
Thank you, Director Bouquet. And is there a second on that?
Second, Sloan.
Thank you, Director Sloan. Appreciate that. Okay, I'm flipping pages all over the place here, and I'll get there eventually. I heard Directors Bouquet and Sloan. I would now like to ask Michael Ford, who is the staff liaison for these meetings, to speak.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Michael Ford, Chief Operations Officer. At this time, I would like to turn this presentation over to our CEO and General Manager, Deborah A. Johnson, to provide recommended action presentation. Thank you.
Ms. Johnson, thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very kindly, and thank you, Mr. Ford, and good evening, Committee Chair Williams and members of the Operations and Safety Committee and other board members that are assembled this evening. As introduced, I'm the General Manager and CEO, and tonight I am presenting staff's recommendation for the agency to leverage a consultancy to conduct a comprehensive assessment of the agency's facilities and fixed route buses in the interest of establishing a holistic and comprehensive plan for RTD's zero emission transition. First, among RTD's board adopted strategic priorities is community value, which states RTD strives to be a community partner, providing value to customers as well as to the broader Denver metro region while sustaining planet Earth. This commitment to sustainability is one that has been shared by members who have served on this board as well as staff members for decades. In keeping with this commitment and in the interest of environmental stewardship, RTD was an early adopter of alternatively fueled buses with the first hybrid electric compressed natural gas mall ride vehicles being placed into service over 20 years ago. Whereas alternative propulsion technologies have changed over time, the agency's commitment to environmental sustainability remains steadfast, as evidenced by RTD's participation in the Federal Transit Administration Sustainable Transit for a Healthy Planet Challenge. In response to this challenge, RTD pledged just a year ago in April of 2022 to increase transit use and reduce single occupancy vehicle usage within the region, decrease carbon dioxide emissions resulting from facilities, fleet vehicles, and fuel use, and use an agency-wide approach to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and increase sustainability as a component of the 2021 through 2026 strategic plan implementation. I come to RTD with a decade and a half of experience in alternatively fueled transit buses, ranging from electric trolley coaches, gasoline hybrid, compressed natural gas with near zero NOx engines, as well as battery electric buses, and more specifically, experience in developing a facilities plan, as well as a fleet plan that accommodated my resident agency's needs. I have engaged on this topic with a multitude of transit agencies and professionals, and my firsthand knowledge and experience has been sought by other agencies taking steps into this realm. Hence, that is why I am presenting this item and coming before you with firsthand knowledge of the importance of an exhaustive approach given the technical and analytical complexity, considering this work virtually touches every facet of transit operations. While RTD staff has also garnered operational knowledge in the realm of battery electric and other alternatively fueled buses, adoption of this recommended action would allow RTD to solicit the services of a consultancy with the requisite subject matter expertise to assist in the formulation of a comprehensive approach to the transition of operating and administrative facilities, as well as 1,000+ clean diesel buses to comprise the current fixed route fleet. The subject matter expertise offered by the selected consultancy is essential, and that a thoughtful, systematic, and comprehensive approach toward the agency's transition is required in the interest of adhering to existing policy guidance at both the state and federal level, achieving aspirational emission reduction strategies, and facilitating the agency's pursuit of state and federal grant funding to bolster transition efforts. Whereas RTD's previous low and no emission transition efforts have focused primarily on fixed route vehicles, existing facilities must be modernized, new facilities must be acquired, or both, to support the proper maintenance, housing, and either charging or fueling of the next generation of alternatively powered vehicles for this agency. In developing this holistic and comprehensive facilities and fleet transition plan over the coming months, the consultancy selected via the procurement process will be required to demonstrate a long-term fleet management plan with a strategy for RTD's use of funding for resources and future acquisitions, address the availability of current and future resources to meet costs for the transition and implementation, consider policy and legislation impacting relevant technologies, evaluate existing and future facilities and their relationship to the overall technology transition, and of course, examine the impact of the transition on RTD's workforce by identifying skill gaps, training needs, and retraining needs of RTD's existing employees. Staff anticipates this ambitious comprehensive plan will be completed no later than the fourth quarter of 2024. In order to engage a consultancy and begin work on this plan as expeditiously as possible, the recommended action before the committee tonight is for the board to both approve the scope of work summary as referenced in the agenda packet and authorize me in my capacity as the general manager and CEO to enter into a contract with the consultancy selected through the agency's rigorous public procurement process. And leveraging this holistic transition plan, the board will set in motion a comprehensive effort to sustainably propel the agency into the future for years to come, both literally and figuratively. With that, Madam Chair, I will conclude my remarks and yield the floor to you to facilitate any questions and comments of committee members. Thank you very kindly.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. Appreciate that. And we appreciate your experience. It's just one of the many reasons that we are glad to have you on board in your position. Right now, I would like to ask those directors who have questions or who wish to speak to raise your virtual hands. And I will call on you in turn. For anyone calling into the meeting, if you wish to speak, please press *9. And I do see that Director Rosenthal has his hand raised. Sir?
Well, thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Madam General Manager and staff for working on this. Maybe this question is more for Mr. McLeod, but where is the money going to come from in order to finance this study?
If I may, Madam Chair, I'll take that question and have our CFO supplement. So recognizing that we had set aside local monies in reference to the next agenda item, which I will be presenting to you in reference to a procurement of a micro fleet of vehicles. We are leveraging those dollars as relates to the cost to leverage a facilities and fleet transition plan. So localized monies that we were previously going to use, and I'm jumping ahead relative to the next agenda item that is in your packet as relates to a cancellation of a contract, the localized monies that have been identified will be utilized for this holistic and comprehensive facilities and fleet transition plan.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you both. I see Director Rusch's hand.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I had the same question as Director Rosenthal but I also have a follow-up to that. Would you be able to briefly describe a little bit like the scope in that this contract would cover? It is for $10 million, and I think it would benefit the committee and the public to understand a little bit more about what this study will present us.
Madam, yes. Director Rusch, I would like to point out that it says up to $10 million. It's not a finite amount, but I'll let Ms. Johnson speak to that.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, and thank you, Director Rusch, for the question. And just to expound on what Director Williams said, keeping in mind that I am coming to you asking for authorization, we have yet to know the actual cost. And while we use that ballpark figure, I think it's important that you all have an understanding what it could be. I would be remiss to say if we went into further detail, it could compromise the integrity of this process due to the fact that this is an open and fair solicitation going forward, and delving deeper into the aspects of the cost, recognizing that we would yet to have put this out, we would be infringing upon the integrity of this being open and fair competition. But to the point in which you raised relative to the scope, that falls in line with my comments that I'm going to make. So recognizing there's a multitude of components relative to developing a scope of work, there will be specific tasks and deliverables upon which qualified bidders will submit proposals. in that it will be technical and analytical in nature. And I do, before I go forward, I want you to know that I'm not sidestepping your question, but traditionally in a public setting such as this, recognizing that we are utilizing public dollars and want to ensure that there's fair competition with solicitations. In most other agencies, scopes of work don't come to the board in this fashion because we would be, for all intents and purposes, releasing a solicitation before they're actually vetted and ready to be released. But with the specific questions in reference to what you're asking, so we're looking at everything from soup to nut relative to looking at our facilities, recognizing our facilities are decades years old, and they were purposefully designed for a specific type of propulsion system, which was diesel buses. So when we talk about looking at what might be viable, recognizing that this is a different transit service delivery model, when we use alternatively fueled vehicles, not knowing what those could be hydrogen fuel cell, it could be battery electric, it could be some emerging technology of which we have no knowledge of. We want to ensure that there's a full-fledged assessment done with viable locations as relates to what we would call duty cycles for our fleets, meaning how long a bus is out on the road to complete what we call various trips. A vehicle is assigned to a block and could be out with our extensive service area for 500 miles. So we need to assess the viability, the feasibility. There will be route modeling that needs to be done. Also, we have to look at the workforce relative to having incredible team members that may be accustomed to being diesel mechanics. How might we leverage stopgap measures to ensure that there's training, not just for our frontline workforce, but also in reference to how we do contracts and procurement. More specifically, how are we basically putting out solicitations that are different in nature from what we customarily do, since there are emerging technologies and there could be multifaceted components of such. Another piece of this quite naturally is, as we go forward, what might we be looking at relative to our current ridership that feeds into the route modeling that may be done, because there could be instances where there are subs that are specializing in the route modeling component of this. Could be somebody in the academia realm, right? Then more specifically, as we talk about another critical components, what might we need in reference to ensuring that we have facilities that are in close proximity from an environmental justice vantage point as we look to see how we're deploying services holistically. Might there be some need for in-route charging whereby we have to work with jurisdictions if we are looking at an inductive charging mechanism? So all of these different elements will be factored into this, recognizing that we want to ensure that it does not lock us into one certain technology, but as we go forward, what could happen in the future for additional years to come. So if you need me to expound, I am more than happy to do so, but I will now yield the floor.
Director Rusha?
No, thank you. That is more than sufficient, and I appreciate the detail. Thank you.
I'd like to point out for anybody who's interested that there are a number of transition plan formats available online. Just if you're looking to get the gist of what's involved in a, let me see if I can say the whole thing, in a low, no emission facility and fleet transition plan, there are models available. Ours will not be identical. Am I correct, Ms. Johnson, in that statement?
Yes, you are, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I don't see any other hands raised. Oh, Director Geisinger, Chair Geisinger, sorry. I'm
Thank
happy
you.
to have you.
And Ms. Johnson and I have had this conversation several times, but I think it's worth having here, which is, there's a recommended action coming up later where the ZEV committee is requesting to have this done by November or get reports monthly after that. And there's a lot of money out there that may not last real long. So I heard you say, Deborah, that, this will be done in phases. And I guess my question is, do you see the possibility of having a phase along the way here that can let us start to apply for other money?
Committee Chair Williams. Madam Chair Geisinger, if I may. Yes.
Yeah.
So yes, this is going to be multifaceted because recognizing where we are as an organization, first and foremost, we need to invest in our assets and our state of good repair. Recognizing that we do have facilities that are older, there's a lot of different avenues in which we can use to actually come full circle and leverage a facility. We have property in and of itself that we have readily available. We have park and ride lots. Those are different options. When we talk about monies that are out there, while I know that there's been a laser-like focus from the board relative to the bipartisan infrastructure law and monies that have been identified through bus facilities, there's other components. We have transit peers in the country that are using TIFIA loans to finance facilities for a holistic near zero or low emission fleet transition plan. There's a multitude of different avenues. And so solely as you look at monies that could be available through the Department of Energy and other facilities monies that are available, we are not going, I would say that it is highly unlikely we would miss out on the opportunity because there are still monies that are readily available to invest in a state of good repair for facilities in and of itself. So the point that you raised about multifaceted, yes. Trying not to go into various aspects because I don't want to show our hand as an organization as we put out a solicitation for a request for proposal, but it will be multifaceted because there's different elements of this plan, recognizing it's holistic and comprehensive that one could use to identify what it is that we need, because there's no doubt that we need a facility in and of itself to be able to house and maintain that meets current building codes as it relates to emergent technologies and things of the like. So yes, to the point about having a plan in November, I will say once again, that is highly unlikely that we would have a full-fledged plan in a matter of a couple of months when we're looking to leverage a solicitation that will entail at least 30 days at a minimum being out on the street and then having very technical and analytical evaluation of said proposals that are submitted.
Okay, thanks. And I guess, I think what I'm hearing is what I want to hear, which is that if I'm right, that there may be steps along the way. For instance, it seems to me like we may need to use some of our property and build a new facility. That might be easier than trying to retrofit a 40-year-old facility. And that may be something that we could request, I guess, in the scope of work or as we're working on, that be an early focus so that we could, we're certainly not going to get 1,000 buses at once, but if we could get that piece phased in and start looking for money for that, if I'm understanding you right, that you will be doing phases, I think that would be a great way to go. Thanks.
Thank you, Chair. I see Director Tisdale's hand is raised.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I will happily yield to other members of the committee first if they have questions, and I can wait until they have exhausted theirs.
Anybody that wants to jump in front, put your hand up now. Nope, we're ready to hear you.
All right, well, thank you. I appreciate that. I will express some degree of surprise, I suppose, at the fact that we're talking about a $10 million contract, and we got 2 questions from committee members. To point out that it's not that it's up to the resolution. The recommended action is not to exceed 10 million, but on page 6 of the report, it says the consultancy for the plan is estimated to cost $10 million. That's a huge sum of money that I think, as Director Ruscia pointed out, with these public funds, we need to be extremely inquisitive relative to this matter. The first question I would have, therefore, is what's the basis for the $10 million estimate?
Ms. Johnson?
Yes, thank you very kindly. And as it relates to the financial impact, we can make an adjustment to that because it shouldn't say it's estimated to cost. So that was an error and it should be in alignment with the other. So thank you for your attention to detail, and we can modify that if this were to go forward to the full board for consideration. And as it relates to what is this predicated upon, I would say it's predicated upon the experience in which we have garnered. It's predicated upon us reaching out to more than 15 dozen transit agencies that have gone through this. It's based upon us doing something collective in reference to having a facilities assessment plan. It's predicated upon doing route modeling, recognizing we have a 2,342 square mile area in which we have very tedious duty cycles. It's also predicated upon the fact that we have 4 seasons here. It's predicated upon the fact that we will be using energy that has to basically support ancillary systems. So we do know from past experience, when we look at the battery usage on our current 36 battery electric bus subfleet, that we know during the course of the summer, when we look at the state of charge, we basically only get about 58%, recognizing in the winter that it may be less of that because we're utilizing the heat to warm the vehicle. So all of those different factors came into play. We looked at others by coordinating through our industry-based platform called Apta Connect and posing various questions relative to practical experience. And we looked at a range of different transit properties, including more than half a dozen within the state of California that have leveraged innovative clean transportation plans adhering to the California Air Resources Board. And then more specifically, looking at transit agencies across the country that are subjected to different weather, i.e. in Rhode Island, in Connecticut, in New York. And we also looked in our own backyard here in Breckenridge, Colorado. So that's how that number came full circle.
Okay, thank you for that. I appreciate that response. And then next, the board report at least indicates that we would expect the plan to be completed in the fourth quarter of 2024. That's 32 months away from now. And I'm wondering if that's our best estimate as to how quickly we can get this done, or is this a sense of we want to, in effect, under promise and over deliver on the actual plan?
Ms. Johnson, it's back to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Director Tisdale, for the question. So recognizing that we talked about a holistic and comprehensive plan, there's different aspects. Chair Williams made reference to looking online to seeing other transition plans. When you look at those transitions plans, you may just see a component as it relates to the rolling stock in and of itself, and you won't see the component as it relates to facilities. That's why we specifically have qualified this as being a facilities and a fleet holistic transition plan, due to the fact that what this agency is in need of are facilities first and foremost. And so as we talk about over-promising, or maybe I'm getting that in the reverse, but for all intents and purposes, this is the comprehensive plan. It's the whole kit and caboodle. So there will be different phases of it that we can leverage. And as I shared before, I am not trying to be cryptic in my response, but then again, I want to ensure that we don't have individuals listening in, making assumptions of what might be as we look for open and fair competition and trying to protect the integrity of the process. But there will be milestones relative to certain deliverables, which would be available as you look at the board report, quite naturally in different phases, yielding something before the last quarter of 2024.
All right, I appreciate that also. Thank you, and that's helpful. The idea that is being floated for discussion later of having monthly reports commencing in November of 2023, I think will probably help address all of this and make people more comfortable with proceeding however we might ultimately do so at the board meeting. And I thank you for the time, Madam Chair and Madam General Manager, CEO.
You are welcome, Director Tisdale. Thank you for your input. Director Broom, I see your hand is raised and there we go.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The scope of this could lead to some very, very expensive propositions for RTD going forward, which means that we need a new revenue source to cover the cost. You can't always rely on federal grants to cover everything. That being the case, we may want to ask the voters if they want to undertake such an expensive conversion, and then perhaps couch the bond question so that it would debruce the district until the complete conversion was accomplished. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Broom. I expected to hear something similar from Director Davidson, if he's still with us, but we appreciate your comments. I don't see any other hands raised at the moment. I'm going to ask Director Broom to put his down. Everybody good for now? We're going to move on down the line. Okay. With Director Bouquet as the mover and Director Sloan as the second, I'm going to ask if this committee is ready to move this action forward to the entire board. Are there any no votes on that? Okay, I'm going to take this as unanimous that the committee recommends that we move this action onto the board. Thank you all very much. So that would be, I think we're missing one director. So I think that's 6 ayes and no noes. We'll move forward. The next action for, do I need to say any more than that? I think I'm good procedurally. Okay. The next action for this committee's consideration is the termination of contract for battery electric buses with New Flyer of America, Inc. And it reads for the Board of Directors to authorize the general manager and CEO to terminate for convenience the contract with New Flyer of America, Inc. for the purchase of 17 battery electric buses, to negotiate termination costs with New Flyer for work satisfactorily performed prior to termination, and to pay such costs from local project funds. Do we have a mover?
So moved, Sloan.
And somebody like to second that?
I'll second it.
Thank you, Director Broom. I'm going to again ask Ms. Johnson to step into the ring, put her gloves on, and let's have some information about this. Mr. Ford, do you want to introduce her, or shall we just let her talk?
Madam Chair, Michael Ford, Chief Operations Officer. I'm happy to allow and have Ms. Johnson speak to this recommended action.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you both, and thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Mr. Ford. I appreciate the opportunity to present this recommended action. As I shared a few moments ago, RTD has demonstrated a lasting commitment to environmental sustainability in keeping with the board adopted strategic priority of community value, as well as the aspirational goals of the state of Colorado's climate action plan and greenhouse gases pollution reduction roadmap. The agency looks to continue the transition of its fixed route bus fleet, which, as you heard moments ago, began decades ago with the deployment of subfleets of alternatively fueled buses, commencing first in the year of 2000, later in 2008, and again in 2017. As RTD sought to further expand its fleet of low and no emission vehicles, the agency was awarded funding in federal fiscal year 2019 for the purchase of electric buses and charging stations, in part from both federal and state grant funds. Following a solicitation and identification of a successful bidder, the board approved the purchase of 17 battery electric buses from New Flyer of America on November 16th, 2021, which, as it happens, was one day after President Biden signed into law the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, now known as the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. So with that, keeping in mind that the Committee of Operations and Safety at that time basically heard this item prior to this coming out of our houses of Congress and going to the president for action. So with that context in reference to the timeline, the contract with New Flyer was executed on January 26, 2022. Following the contract's execution, staff continued to evaluate how these 17 new battery electric buses would be integrated into the agency's service delivery model. Over the next few months, staff assessed the optimal location for a facility to house the 17 battery electric buses and determined that the most suitable existing property available was the East Metro facility, which was originally purpose-built over 40 years ago for a large diesel fixed route bus fleet. The necessary requirements for a diesel fleet are not analogous to those of alternatively fueled vehicles. For example, for battery electric buses, harness restraints are needed for technicians to access the battery packs, as well as lifts and hoist, in addition to a comprehensive fire suppression system and thermal monitoring platform. I should note that due to the operating environment here in the Denver metro region that have longer duty cycles due to the size of the service area, being 2,342 square miles, as well as 4 widely varying weather seasons. Battery electric buses must be stored in a facility properly equipped to maintain, charge, and house the vehicles. And also, I should say, mitigate any type of incident relative to fire and life safety, and should be sited in a location that minimizes time spent in non-revenue transit to preserve the state of charge. At this time, staff determined that retrofitting the East Metro facility was not practical and instead opted to explore the construction of a new building adjacent to the facility. It was during this time that staff conducted its preliminary facility analysis that the board was asked to consider on October 11th of 2022, and a recommended action requesting that the contract be paused. This was due to the fact that staff had by that time determined that the specialized nature of the facility designed and equipped to support the unique charging, maintenance, and housing needs of the 17 New Flyer battery electric buses would critically limit the facility's capacity to support vehicles utilizing other low or no emission propulsion technologies or related components in the future. At an estimated cost of $85 million, staff could not justify, nor could I, as the general manager and CEO, support an investment of that nature for a facility to house such a small number of buses, which constitutes not even 2% of the agency's overarching bus fleet. As a frame of reference, RTD's current fixed route fleet consists of more than 1,000 clean diesel vehicles, which would be phased out over time, as I have described in previous reports. The cancellation of the battery electric bus contract is not a reflection of the original equipment manufacturer. Rather, it is a course correction as RTD forges a new path forward towards a zero emission future, one that is based upon a comprehensive approach toward the holistic transition of the agency's facilities and as well as its fixed route bus fleet. Simply put, without the necessary facilities in place, I cannot support, and RTD should not endeavor to expand its low or no emission bus fleet. In closing, while it is certainly disappointing to have to recommend the cancellation of this contract, under the circumstances, I can endorse no other course of action. Further, in canceling this contract, RTD positions itself to be more nimble and expeditiously address a cleaner future in transit service delivery. With that, Madam Chair, I will conclude my remarks and once again yield the floor to you to facilitate any discussion amongst committee members for questions and comments. Thank you very kindly for the opportunity to come before you.
Thank you, General Manager. First, I'd like to recognize that Director Deschel has joined us. And then I would ask those directors who have questions or wish to speak to this issue to raise your virtual hands, and I will call on you in turn. I have questions myself, but I'm going to wait to see if there are other directors who wish to speak first. Anybody? Put your hand up. There's Director Rosenthal. Sir, you have the floor.
Oh, it's okay. Thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, General Manager, CEO. So, in terms of the design of our bus barns, the facilities that we have, to what extent, was some of that information maybe available or not available when we decided on whether to purchase those electric buses? So we just approved a study that's going to take some time. So understanding, and what I'm trying to get at is understanding that a lot of this analysis takes time, and perhaps did we not have enough time to really take it to its logical conclusions about before we went into adopting purchasing these buses.
Madam Chair, if I may. And
Please, ma'am.
thank you, Director Rosenthal. I'm going to try to answer your question, but please feel free to interrupt me if I'm not tracking with you exactly. So what I believe I heard is that you posed the question whether or not there was an assessment done prior to us accepting this federal fiscal year grant in 2019 and moving forward with a request for proposals for procurement of 17 battery electric buses. Do I have that correct?
Yeah, and sort of from a technical standpoint, it's been a while, but we didn't really discuss so much about the bus barns, the facilities at that time. So perhaps those sorts of discussion items could only come with further in-depth analysis. Is that more the case?
I would say, recognizing that when this first came full circle relative to this fiscal year grant, at that point in time, there were monies that were readily available, and a lot of transit agencies across the country were basically looking at purchases of purchases, that's redundant. I meant to say purchases of vehicles. And recognizing that at the time we utilized the information that we had readily available, i.e. modeling after what we had as our current fleet, which are battery electric buses that are dedicated to a specific right-of-way, being the 16th Street Mall. More specifically, those battery electric buses are customized for that right-of-way that I have just described, being the 16th Street Mall, and weren't intended to run in mixed flow traffic. Recognizing that as a backdrop, and also recognizing that in the public transit industry here in the United States, that there's no standards relative to zero emission vehicles, our staff did their due diligence and leveraged the experience they had with their current fleet in making determinations as a path forward. Secondly, as we talk about, okay.
Please proceed, that's okay.
Okay, so recognizing that we use that information that we had readily available, and those buses were manufactured by a different original equipment manufacturer. Through the evolution of these emergent technologies, there are things that have come to light relative to the battery composition and things of the like that we did not have at the time, recognizing that coming to the board to authorize the general manager to enter into a contract with the original equipment manufacturer with the bus procurement is a little different from other procurements, in the sense that when you're negotiating a contract, you're going to do that, and then you talk about the design component. So after leveraging that contract that was entered into in January of 2022, there were discussions with the OEM whereby there were design components that came to light. And so as we, as staff, went through that process, we recognized that there could be problems in relationship to the facilities that we currently had available. And in turn, that's when we made it apparent and approached the board to say, time out, we need to share information with all of you, and hence the pause in the contract while we try to assess our current environment with more information that was readily available to see if we could actually modernize our East Metro facility to accommodate this subfleet of 17 vehicles. And doing so, what we learned was that we would be limited in modernizing that facility by accommodating 17 battery electric buses, in which we would expend approximately $85 million that did not basically allow us to have future expansion for years to come. That concludes my response. I'm sorry, I sort of.
No, that's very exhaustive. I appreciate that analysis. So, and then my final question is, so given that, and I want to put the cart before the horse, because as you indicated, we're going to be studying this, both at different types of technology and our facilities over the next, I believe it's 22 months. I thought I heard Director Tisdale say 32. I think it's 22. So if it's from now until the end of next year. So yeah, so, but that's still, it's an extensive period of time, extensive analysis. So given so as one of the, and I know you may not want to go into the possible options at this point about facilities, but you mentioned one possibility, and that is remodeling our East Metro bus barn. Any other possibilities that you could mention of if we're not going, other than doing that, in order to house these potential, it could be electric, it could be hydrogen, it could be other technologies. If we didn't just do that, what are some of their other opportunities and possibilities that you possibly might explore?
General Manager, yes.
Yes, thank you, ma'am. So Director Rosenthal, just for a point of clarification, when we talked about remodeling East Metro, that was to accommodate a minimum of 17 battery electric buses with the potential up to 25, but we would be constrained, recognizing the zoning limitations for that property in that location. So I just wanted to clarify that for everybody's edification. When we talk about the options that are available, what we will be asking a consultancy to do is look at everything, what's available. Does it make sense, for instance, to utilize a current facility and perhaps do something differently relative to housing vehicles to build on land we already possess? It could range from leveraging a park and ride facility that we currently have that has minimum capacity. I do know that holistically, when we had other plans, there has been 5 different sites that have been identified for, green sourcing and things of the like. So there's a lot of different mechanisms, and there could be some that we have not thought of holistically going forward. So recognizing one aspect, which is customary, so I will say this, when we do retain the services of a consultancy, it will be incumbent upon that consultancy to look at previous plans in which we had, as we look at our comprehensive operational analysis, both the short and long-term planning documents that we have, i.e. Reimagine RTD, the system optimizations plan and the mobility plan for the future, looking at strategic plans, looking at the bus rapid transit plan that were done. It runs the gamut. So everything is available, I would say, as we go full stream ahead. And I would stop there.
Thank you for that. Director Rosenthal, you okay? I see Director Tisdale's hand is raised.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I appreciate the opportunity. Again, if there are other committee members who would wish to speak first, I'm happy to forestall my comment.
No, I think that you are good at the moment, and I just want to note for the record that Chair Geisinger has been lost in the internet ozone and is attempting to come back to the meeting.
All right, thank you. I do want to take a moment to expand upon and emphasize some of the remarks by General Manager CEO, because it is critical. This is an unusual step. Canceling a contract, a major contract for acquisition of vehicles, is a huge action to be taken by the board. It is not a routine or customary action. And I think that the marketplace needs to know that. And we are aware that the public will react to this in a significant way, wondering why have we stepped back from the purchase of electric buses. And it is fair to say too that there could be an impression in the mind of the public that this was a case of ready, fire, aim. And we have to address that. And I think the general manager CEO has to some extent addressed that. So I do want to emphasize again that the changed circumstances that we encountered in learning more about battery electric buses and their implementation and their maintenance and their storage, we did not have all of that information in the first instance because it was simply not available, because a lot of this has come about through changes in technology, greater public awareness, new information, a better assessment of risks associated with all of this. And those factors, among others that had been particularly enumerated by General Manager CEO, were part of the determination for this recommended action to come forward that we should in fact terminate this contract for convenience at this time. And as I say, just because I think some people without that information might come to a significantly negative conclusion, it behooves us to restate that here. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you, Director Tisdale. Director Rusha.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Director Tisdale and I are 2 for 2 in agreement today. I also just wanted to state that I don't believe any person on this board, this committee, or in our senior administration takes this lightly. This is an incredibly difficult decision. I think we are voting today with a little bit of heartache. Cancellation of a contract like this is, not only comes with some expense, but it also, appears, as Director Tisdale said, to be a bit of a stumbling block for us publicly and our stated commitment to a greener planet. So with that, I really do just want to, on the record, just state my appreciation to our GM CEO. I do believe she did her due diligence, staff did their due diligence, and I think that they looked at every possible avenue, all the alternatives before bringing this recommendation to us, recommended action to us. And I just wanted to say that on the record, again, this is a difficult conversation. This is a difficult decision, but I am heartened by our previous action and our commitment to creating a robust transition plan and an agency that is, greener, cleaner, safer, and I would even add more environmentally just. So thank you. And again, Ms. Johnson, I do want to just directly thank you for all of your work on this.
Thank you, Director Rusha. Ms. Johnson, I see your hand up next. Director Guzman, I recognize you after Ms. Johnson speaks. And then, as I said, I have a number of questions and comments.
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you, Madam Chair, and thank you, Director Tisdale and Rusha. What I will say, I appreciate the acknowledgement, because recognizing I shared my background and I've been in this space in the alternatively fueled space, let's categorize it as such, for 15 years. This wasn't done lightly, and staff has worked diligently. And I am going to take this opportunity to say, once we disseminated the press release and it was featured in an industry publication being Mass Transit, I was contacted, as well as our subject matter expert, Fred Worthen, by a myriad of different individuals within the industry that said, wow, you guys have some backbone, in the sense that we would love to do this, recognizing that there have been a lot of different steps. And oftentimes what we heard when we got some feedback from varying agencies, that they shared with us, allocate enough time to develop plans, understand goals and objectives, don't put politics ahead of technology and industry expertise. And now I've been asked by some very esteemed colleagues to share our experience as we go forward. And I will, in my comments, with saying it's really interesting relative to the bipartisan infrastructure law coming full circle and fleet and transition plans being required, because when the federal government leveraged these dollars for low and no technologies to be explored, a couple of things happened. There weren't requirements. I can recall at a different agency going to advocate on Capitol Hill and having conversations with appropriation staffers on the Senate side of the House who shared a story about a transit entity that basically acquired battery electric buses and had no idea the charging equipment was needed. And so they couldn't leverage their technology, their buses. And then I recall being at another agency where I got a call from elected saying, can we use your chargers for our buses? And they were totally different chargers because we were using plugins where they were using overhead as what I call the hair dryers, and having to explain that. So recognizing that these are emerging technologies and that there is no standards at this point in time, and we have been in these spaces working diligently, I would be remiss not to acknowledge the hard work of staff, because it's required all hands on deck. And I can assure you, when they came to me and said, I don't know, I rolled up my sleeves and recognized what needed to happen as we went forward. So I thank the board for the acknowledgement, because this gives me angst and heartache as well. But knowing that we were doing this for the betterment of the agency brings me a great sense of pride. And I commend you all for having the courage to stand with us and make this difficult decision, if in fact that's the way it goes. So thank you very kindly.
Thank you, General Manager. We appreciate that. Director Guzman.
I'm new here. And I want to make sure that it's on the record, as a new director, this action coming before your committee and potentially before the board later doesn't reduce our commitment to getting zero emission vehicles in our fleet or our commitment to the environment. And Ms. Johnson, I do not envy you having to come before this board and say this, because it is angstful and it does cause a lot of heartache. I wasn't here when they made these original decisions, but I am here now. And so I just want to recommit, at least for my little slice of heaven in District C, that we are committed to doing this along with you. And I thank you and the staff for your very diligent work and the difficult message you're giving to us. It's not going to be an easy decision, but I don't discount that you have done your due diligence and your team has done their homework and presented this in a manner that is at least palatable. To Second Tisdale and Director Rusha, we do need to brace for impact in some ways and be able to discuss this properly with the public. And I think that that is a consideration all directors should take to heart, because this is going to be a major decision if it proceeds. So thank you for the information and thank you for presenting this recommended action.
Thank you, Director Guzman, for being a part of this discussion. Okay, I've been patient, well behaved, which is unusual. I have a couple of points that I'd like us to discuss in committee before we take this recommended action to the board. Ms. Johnson or Mr. Ford, who I believe is still with us, do we have somebody here who can speak to the comparison between clean diesel vehicles and battery electric buses in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, but batteries and what it takes to make those batteries? Is there any way we can talk about that for a second?
Madam Chair, if I may.
Please.
We can talk, recognizing that there's probably a more in-depth discussion that could be had as we come full circle, and that will come as it relates to the endeavor that we will take with our fleet transition plan that shows, the particulates that are emitted and things of the like, because there's different components relative to, as I was saying, near zero NOx engines and things of the like. But I would yield the floor to our subject matter expert, being Mr. Fred Worthen, to address that. And I see he's on camera. So,
Mr. Worthen, we'd be happy to hear, and then I have a couple more points, but you can start there.
Okay, that's a very difficult question to answer because when you look at different technologies, you really have to look at well to wheel. It's not just what goes in, what comes out of the tailpipe. It's the entire life cycle of a vehicle from the time it is manufactured, the operational components, the energy that is used to charge the vehicle, and also the disposal of the vehicle too. Very different technologies. I will say that diesel vehicles over the years have, they started out in the 80s very dirty. I think everybody remembers the black smoke that used to billow out of them. But over the years, there have been quite a few different Clean Air Act bills at the national level that have required reductions in particulate matter out of the buses and reductions in NOx and greenhouse gases. With the latest, I believe it was 2010 was the last major iteration. Diesel exhaust fluid was, the way the legislation was passed, it required diesel exhaust fluid to basically neutralize most of the particulates. I don't want to get too technical, but what happens is it goes into a chamber and the diesel exhaust fluid basically evaporates the NOx and turns it into water. So the pollution that comes from a diesel vehicle is virtually non-existent. I won't say that it's non-existent, but it is very, very low compared to what it was back into the 80s. The other component, though, that I would like to remind everybody is that the diesel exhaust that comes from our vehicles is less than 0.5% of the emissions in the entire region. Our real opportunity to reduce greenhouse gases, NOx, and other poisonous gases, as you would call it, is to get people out of single occupant vehicles and onto our vehicles. So I'm sorry, I can't give you an exact science because the reduction in greenhouse gases is highly dependent upon the vehicle chosen and how it is operated and utilized in service. But I would say that the belief that diesels are dirty like they used to be, the changes that have come through at the federal level have really made it where the diesel exhausts are minimal now compared to what they were 20, 30 years ago.
Thank you very much, Mr. Worthen. I have a couple more. I'm going to take chair's privilege here because I'm with the rest of the directors that we want to talk about this as much as possible. Can you tell me, Mr. Worthen, what happens to buses that are replaced by battery electric buses if they were to be?
Typically, in the past, what we have typically done is sent them out to auction, and they have gone as scrap and sold for very small prices. The VW grant that was out there actually requires that the vehicles have a hole put in the block of the engine, so the engine is not usable again. The rest of the bus is left intact, but the engine would be disabled.
Thank you, and that leads me right to.
If I can.
Yes, you may, absolutely, jump in.
Yes, add on something else. So when we talk about the disposition of vehicles relative to replacing them, there's a couple of different elements I just wanted to broach. So recognizing that we have to factor in of how a bus was procured. If we were using federal dollars, we have to ensure that it meets its useful life, which is 500,000 miles or 12 years. If in fact it doesn't meet that threshold and we've utilized funds, we may have to return said monies to the federal government. To the point that Mr. Worthen raised, yes, they can be auctioned off. And then in some other areas, we could cannibalize those vehicles as well, recognizing that we could use those spare parts if in fact we still have the same make and model from the OEM in our fleet. So I just wanted to provide additional context relative to that.
Thank you. That's the kind of thing I'm looking for. And these are the kind of questions that I believe need to go into the transition plan, is that we have to look at all of these pieces. That was just my thinking as I was reading through this. And I think that everybody mentioned that we have an existing fleet of 36 is right, battery electric buses that we have for a long time been at the forefront of the move to be as ecologically friendly and as technologically forward-thinking as possible. But my understanding is that we are not adding to that existing fleet because they were built specifically for us under a separate deal. And so I think those are the kind of questions that we are going to hear from our constituents. And I'd also like to point out that I think Mr. Worthen could probably speak to this, but I might be able to speak to it because I've asked questions. There are limitations to the existing fleet, which is why they are mall buses. Is that right, Ms. Johnson, Mr. Worthen?
If I can start, and I'll yield the floor to Mr. Worthen if further explanation is needed. So recognizing that these vehicles were custom built and they're utilized in a rotation for a service that basically have buses coming every 5 minutes. They were designed with a specific cab. And while we have a mall detour right now, they're in mixed use, basically, which isn't yielding well for our overarching sustainability of said vehicle because they were designed to run along a specific right of way. And so more to the point, the original equipment manufacturer, as it stands, they've been sort of reconfigured, but we couldn't buy those buses in the here and now with Buy America and Build America. So recognizing the point that I raised previously, that there's no standards as we go forward. One thing that I've learned in my experience, when you have a workforce, and we talk about the investment in our workforce, when you have disparate sub-fleets, recognizing that you need to have training for those different sub-fleets, that becomes a greater expense holistically, as well as we look to investing in the overarching service delivery model as well. So wanted to add that, and I'll yield the floor to Mr. Worthen if there's anything else you would like to add on.
No, I think that, Madam Chair, sorry. I think that you've covered it very well. Since those vehicles were designed specifically for that operation, they don't have some of the equipment as well that we operate in General Revenue Service. They don't have fare collection, and they also have turning radius issues. They operate lower than our existing fleet does, so they are a little more difficult to turn and maneuver than the existing fleet. So they also operate at lower speeds. So those are some of the major differences that make a little more challenging to put them into other types of service in the region.
Thank you, Mr. Worthen and Ms. Johnson. Then I have, I think, one more, and then I'll, I think Mr. Stoppelkamp can probably speak to the fact, if he's still with us, that we have facility issues related not only to the purchase of new buses, but to our existing buses that have to be where they are relative to where they work. And that these are facilities that we have that do house our existing fleet. Did I say that right?
Madam Chair, if I think what you're saying, recognizing that we have centralized locations where we deploy services so we can basically minimize our deadhead, we have them coming out based upon the routes in which they're serving. That's what I thought I heard you say.
That's what I was trying to say. Thank you very much for saying that better. Mr. Stoppelkamp, you have anything you want to add to my confused question?
I think you got it, General Manager Johnson answered it appropriately. The facilities we have are designed for the operation plan that we have today and the current fleet we have today, and they are working as intended.
And if I may, Madam Chair, that's why it's so critical when we talk about the holistic facility and fleet transition plan, that route modeling is key. Because when you think about the state of charge and recognizing, as I said, what we call our duty cycles, how long a bus will be out there, we want to ensure that we're maximizing the usefulness of said vehicle by deploying it out of the facility that is most appropriate as we go forward. And that's why it's important when I talked about, to Director Rush's question, that there could be a subcontractor that is in the realm of academia as we look at route modeling and what that may be in different seasons and things along the line. So that was a very good question for me to just bring that full circle, because, you know, recognizing that I've worked in different areas that have different service areas, while we may have had, when I was in a different area that was 49 square miles, but we had nearly a million boardings per day, the routes weren't as long when you think about 7 miles via 7 miles. But then again, we had trolley coaches that were powered by electric lines going forward. And so that's why we need something that really explores what is sort of indigenous to our service area. And that's why the route modeling piece and looking at the facilities and maybe other aspects of land are so important as we go forward, and recognizing that we may have to step back and do our service planning a little differently than we did previously. So thank you for being able to ramble on.
That's all right. I was reminded of the route master that we have, Mr. Jesse Carter, who I think is on this meeting with us, who does wonders all day, every day with trying to get our riders the best service that we can provide based on what we have. I see Mr. Guzman wants to join the conversation. Director Guzman, Director.
Thank you so much, Chair Williams. So I have a question. It occurs to me while we're having this conversation, I should probably ask this. We're talking about diversifying funds in our other committee. And I'm just curious, it's a little bit interrelated. We keep talking about land, facilities, etc. With the plan that you previously brought before this committee, is there opportunity to seek funding for building facilities? Are there opportunities for a plan for the infrastructure grants or anything like that, that we would be able to use that plan to go after? I don't know how it works, so I'm going to claim my naivety right here, but I would assume that, you know, the push to buy American and the push to develop greener technologies also includes the ability to build the infrastructure that's required. What I mean by that also is it's a bit of a fallacy to believe that a zero emissions vehicle, one single zero emissions vehicle, does not produce emissions some way, somehow. It still needs to be powered, and energy has to come from somewhere, and it has to be transported or stored. And so in doing this holistic view, right, we keep throwing that word around, and it is a good word, but I'm thinking about the bigger picture outside of just the vehicle itself, or the battery source for that vehicle. Are there opportunities for funding that we are aware of? And in doing this study, would that lead us to be able to capture some of those funds, federal, state, or local, to be able to proceed with the type of infrastructure build out that we would need, given the state of our region right now? Sorry, it's a bit convoluted, but I think
you got it.
understand what I'm saying.
We understood you, and I see that our number one employee here has got the answer, because she was trying to jump through the screen. Go ahead, General.
So I was like, yes, yes, yes. And so basically this gives us an opportunity, recognizing that there's no way humanly possible we can transition a fleet. This is going to be years to come as we look at where we are collectively. One thing that I would just share with you, recognizing I worked at an agency in California previous to this one, whereby I worked on that fleet transition plan, had the opportunity to partake just 2 weekends ago in a 60th anniversary of said transit agency. And what was so interesting is that something that I did 3 years ago, they're working on modernizing the facility that came full circle from that facilities plan. And so recognizing that there will be incremental steps as we come full steam ahead, there will be opportunities to identify varying funding sources, and they could be multifaceted, because there could be things that we don't even know about here and now. As we look at forecasting relative to diversifying funds and things of the like, I don't know if you heard my previous comments, but there's a multitude of different funding sources, and there could be something that's readily available at a regional level, at a state level. I don't want to speak too much out of school here, but there have been conversations relative to, hey, perhaps we need to have some skin in the game holistically as we look at really minimizing our carbon footprint, whether that's scope 1, whether it's scope 2, and I don't want to take away from the ad hoc committee as they talk about the next agenda item. But as we look at this, yes, there is an opportunity. I've had the opportunity to speak with our CFO. He and his stellar team recognizing that there could be opportunities as we invest in our future holistically. Maybe there's something along the lines of where we have a current facility that we look at yielding that land and maybe doing a facility elsewhere. So there's a multitude of opportunities that will come full circle, and quite naturally a part of this plan in and of itself are looking at costs and financing and things of the like that are currently available at the time the plan is being drafted. So don't know if that necessarily answered your question specifically, but all of this is evolving and will certainly be evergreen, and no pun intended.
Thank you for answering that. And Madam Chair, thank you for indulging my second bite at that apple.
Yeah, no problem. So what I would like to suggest is if there's no more discussion tonight, I'd like us to move this recommended action on to the whole board. If everybody has had their bite of the apple, thank you, Director Guzman. So I have, as the mover, I have Director Sloan, I have Director Broom as the second. Are there any no votes on moving this recommended action forward? Okay, hearing none, that motion passes with, I can never count, 6 of us voting to move it forward. We have then, boy, I'm just not procedurally on top of it tonight. I apologize. There is also one discussion item on the agenda. The item is the zero emission policy draft proposed amendment. And I would like to ask if Director Deschel is with us, if he's willing to speak to this.
I am. Can you hear me okay?
I can hear you just fine. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I apologize. I am in transit and I'm literally 2 minutes from my destination. I thought I was going to make it on time, but had to adjust.
You don't ever have to apologize for being in transit. That's what we're all about.
Thank you. By way of background, the Zero Emission Vehicle Ad Hoc Committee was convened last year. It's carried forward this year. The reason why it's coming to this committee as a discussion item instead of a recommended action is procedurally last fall it went through executive committee to be voted on by the full board, and wanted to provide that transparency that typically this is an item that would come to this committee, but because it was delayed at the executive, or excuse me, postponed at the executive committee, it's coming through this way as a discussion item. Specifically, the policy looks at scope 1 and scope 2, working to reduce RTD's scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. Just for background, scope 1 emissions are those emissions which the agency or organization produces themselves, whereas scope 2 emissions are the emissions that are affiliated with the energy that's used to power that company or organization's operations. Scope 3 emissions, which aren't included in the policy proposal, are the emissions of what is used upstream or downstream in your economics. So to just provide a real example for us, the gas that is burned by our buses and by our boilers to keep the buildings warm would be considered scope 1 emissions. Those are emissions that we directly cause and create as an agency. Scope 2 emissions would be the emissions affiliated with the power and the grid mix that is used in order to power our buildings and our other operations. And scope 3 emissions, which aren't a part of the policy, would be those emissions that are affiliated with our procurement, employee travel, employee commuting to the office, things of that nature. We as a committee had many a discussion about all of these items. And I think it heard a lot of sort of familiar discussion here tonight. We wanted to focus on scope 1 and 2 emissions versus zero emission vehicles for two reasons. One, as has been discussed tonight, we're not just talking about transitioning vehicles. We're talking about transitioning a system. And the second is we wanted the focus to be on the goal, which is reducing carbon emissions, right? The goal of converting to battery electric or hydrogen is, well, maybe it is, but shouldn't be to get the award to say we have the largest electric fleet in the nation, right? The purpose, the intent behind all of this is to say that we're doing our part to reduce carbon emissions. And so recognizing that these things come at a cost, we tried to both lean on, what the environmental community uses for measuring carbon efficiency and carbon emissions, but also wanted to, make sure that we weren't going to be putting the agency in a position where we would be acting to our own detriment in order to fulfill a policy goal. And so that was some of the logic that went into sort of the drafting of what's in front of you today. I do want to address a few points that were raised sort of throughout tonight's discussion that were sort of applicable here. One is directly related to carbon emissions, which is that buildings in many measurements actually emit more than transportation. And so the ability to, whether that's electrify or reduce carbon emissions is critical. And you've seen that on the legislative side here in Colorado, whether that's the state's building performance standards, Denver's Energize Denver, Boulder has an ordinance, built performance standards ordinance. And so there's sort of a recognition that it's buildings in addition to transportation. The other item which AGM Worthen raised was that, there's only 1.5% in our area, according to the EPA, from public transit. The other way to say that is we're the only gig in town, or one of the only gigs in town. So we have the opportunity by ourselves to meaningfully move the needle on carbon emissions. I can't decide who gets on a bus and who doesn't get on a bus. We can decide how much that specific bus emits. And while some may say it's a small percentage, I view it as a real opportunity. And so just wanted to provide that sort of, and financing was the final piece. There are, Director Guzman raised this, right? But in many ways, our facilities are light industrial buildings, light to medium industrial buildings, many of our facilities. And there are a lot of monetary options available under the new Inflation Reduction Act and its state and local policies that deal with items such as energy audits, implementation of energy audits, building transition, net zero building transitions. And so we really wanted to prioritize scope 1 and scope 2 because it gets to the core of the issue, and it also gives staff that flexibility to look at more creative funding and financing mechanisms. It, I think, broadens our opportunities for grants. And so that's really what was sort of the driving force behind how we got to the language we're at today. I'm happy to answer any questions. It was fantastic to work with Chair Williams, Chair Geisinger, Director Bouquet, as well as others who joined us periodically. And yeah, available for questions or comments or suggestions.
Thank you so much, Director Deschamps. We appreciate that. Well spoken. Director Sloan, you have questions here?
I do. I have one question, and that is, in light of the comprehensive nature of the transition plan, how do you see the zero emission policy meshing with the information we will get in the transition plan, in that it's looking at facilities as well as vehicles?
I'm gonna toss that ball around the room and say, who wants to speak to that? Director Deschamps?
Yeah, I think this gets to the heart of the management versus policy, right? Which is, from my perspective, right? The board sets a policy that says we want to reduce carbon emissions, and the first step to doing that is creating a fleet and facilities transition plan. And so I view them as complementary to one another. And I also think the policy itself helps bolster and complement, right, what was discussed tonight. And I think, we've, just to be clear, staff, Ms. Johnson, Mr. Worthen, and others have been present at most, if not all, of our ZEV committee, ad hoc committee meetings. But I view them as complementary. So I think that's sort of the short answer is they build upon one another. The transition plan is an element of fulfilling the policy that the board lays out.
I'd have to agree with that. Thank you, Director Deschel. Director Sloan, does that
Yeah.
answer your question?
Thank you, Director Deschel. And
Okay, I see Director Tisdale wants, where's that apple, Director Guzman? Give that to Director Tisdale.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. I'll try to keep it a small bite. The one thing that I wanted to specifically commend relative to the proposed amendments as found on packet page 10 of our board packet, looking at the first highlighted, printed in red paragraph in the proposed amendments, asking that the board receive monthly updates relative to the transition plan if such plan is not ready prior to November 23 Operations Committee meeting. Now, we know that pursuant to the recommended action we've already approved for forwarding to the full board this evening, talks about actually having a contract that would be in place as of September 1, 2023. So we don't expect that there would be a completed report by November, but it does conclude as of December 24. And yes, Director Rosenthal, I did miscount the months earlier. Sorry about that. But the point is the contract life from September 23 to December 24 is 16 months. And, excuse me, on a $10 million contract, that works out to $21,000 a day. So I think if it goes past November, it's fair when we're spending $21,000 a day or so on a consultant that we do get some monthly updates on this to implement the policy that we're talking about as a potential proposed amendment to come forward later. Thank you very much. That concludes my observation.
Thank you, Director Tisdale. I don't know if anybody is watching could see my hands go up. I'd like to note that it definitely says a maximum of $10 million. So hopefully we will not spend all of that. Thank you. Director Guzman, you're up.
Just a piece of indigenous thought that I will bring to this committee. When we're looking at the transition plan, zero emissions vehicles, lowering our carbon footprint is important, but it's a full cycle, right? Carbon is naturally a byproduct of being human or being a mammal. And so how are we closing the loop is the question that I have. A lot of talk about lowering GHGs and lowering all of these other things, but how are we closing the loop? How are we as an agency really committing to zero emissions if we're not talking about the end result of what we're doing, regardless of the amount of gases that we're putting into the air? How are we cleaning it up? We talk about being good stewards at our meetings. We read the land acknowledgement, and part of being a good steward is understanding that it is a full cycle. So just a thought going forward that maybe we need to consider how we close that loop. And if the expectation is that we are going to reduce these carbon footprints, really, truly do it, and not in a disingenuous manner saying we're buying green credits from somewhere. How are we as an agency closing that loop? That's all I have. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Guzman. I'd like to note that earlier in our discussion, General Manager Johnson did note that as a public transit agency, our commitment is to reduce the number of single occupancy vehicles. And so I think that that is part of the answer, but I appreciate you asking that we as an agency keep that in mind. Okay, if that's a sufficient answer, you need to take your hand down. Chair Geisinger.
Thank you. I apologize. I apparently have Wi-Fi issues and got kicked off for a while. But in terms of closing the loop I mean, I've been on the ZEB committee. I'm a big supporter of this. I like the idea that we have added the caveats, and particularly that if this process is going to affect our ability to provide service, let's discuss it and see. I think at this point, our ability to provide service is largely a workforce issue, and we're making progress on that. But I appreciate and agree with Fred Worthen's comments that this is all very critical. I think it's important. I'm glad we're looking at a policies to lead the staff and moving forward with the transition plan and bringing back service so people will ride the buses again and we can increase ridership. I shouldn't say ride them again, they're coming back, but we have a ways to go to come back pre-pandemic, I think is equally important. Thanks.
Thank you, Chair Geisinger. Seeing no other hands at the moment, are there any other matters that anyone wants to? Director Deschel, I see your hand. Director Geisinger is going to put her hand down momentarily. And then we will recognize Director Deschel.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to note that in the event folks have suggested or recommended language changes, and don't worry, I eat the core when I go for the apple. That's the number of bites I like to take. I don't actually eat the core anymore. But please email me. I'm happy to work with folks. And Director Guzman, I think you definitely raised the importance of full life cycle, but also making sure that carbon credits are not a part of our plan, or if they are, that they're really intentionally thought out and might be things that maybe RTD is generating itself. Carbon credits and carbon offset credits are a fascinating topic beyond the scope of tonight's conversation, but happy to have it if others would like to. But please feel free to send in any recommended amendments so that we can, to the language, so that we can work to incorporate those when the amendment is actually brought forward at the executive committee later this month. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Deschel. Well said. Okay, I think we are about finished here. Director Deschel ate the core of the apple. It's always operations and safety committee meetings are fun. Seeing no other matters to discuss and no other hands raised, don't you dare. The next meeting date is Wednesday, May 10th at the same time, at the same location. And I will ask for a move to adjourn.
So move, Bouquet.
Thank you, Director Bouquet. Do we need a second to adjourn? I'll second it. We stand adjourned at 7:03 this evening. Thank you all for your participation.